Evelyn had grown accustomed to the quiet. At 53, her days were a steady rhythm of solitude and predictability. Mornings began with tea, steeped just the way she liked, followed by hours spent tending to her small but flourishing garden. The afternoons slipped by with books and old music, and evenings brought the hum of television shows she barely watched. It wasn't a bad life, it was peaceful, if a little lonely. The world outside had grown distant over the years. Friends had moved away, or grown busy with grandchildren. Evelyn's own children, now adults, called occasionally but lived lives too full for anything beyond brief check-ins. It wasn't bitterness that filled the gaps, but a quiet acceptance. This was the season of her life, she thought. A stretch of calm after the whirlwind of youth and motherhood. Her trips to the grocery store were one of the few outings she genuinely looked forward to. The aisles, familiar as old friends, offered a strange comfort. The smell of fresh bread, the bright displays of fruit. It was a small reminder that the world still moved and thrived. It was on one such ordinary trip that she first saw him. Evelyn was scanning the shelves in the spice aisle, muttering to herself about the absurd price of saffron, when a voice cut through her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am, sorry to interrupt, but do you know if this is the same as smoked paprika?" She turned, startled by the question, and found herself looking into the warm brown eyes of a man who couldn't have been older than his early 30s. He held up a jar of paprika, his expression sheepish yet genuinely curious. "Oh no," Evelyn replied, regaining her composure. "That's regular paprika. Smoked has a deeper flavor. It's great for stews or anything with a smoky base." "Good to know," he said, smiling. "I'm attempting a recipe way above my skill level." Apparently, there was something disarming about him. The easy smile, the slight awkwardness. Evelyn felt a flicker of amusement, a small warmth she hadn't expected. "You'll be fine," she said. "Cooking's just about experimenting. Worst case scenario, you order takeout." He laughed, a sound that seemed to light up the space around them. "Good point. Thanks for the advice. I'm Ryan, by the way." "Evelyn." She nodded, feeling a strange self-consciousness she hadn't felt in years. "Well, Evelyn, if my dinner turns out edible, I'll owe it to you." With a wink, he moved on, leaving her standing there with a jar of saffron in her hand and a slight, inexplicable flutter in her chest. As she finished her shopping, Evelyn couldn't shake the brief encounter. It was nothing, she told herself, a chance meeting with a friendly stranger. But as she drove home, she realized how rare it was to feel seen, even in the smallest of ways. For the first time in years, someone, had broken through the monotony of her carefully curated days. It wasn't a spark, not yet, but it was something. And in the quiet of her car, Evelyn allowed herself to smile. Evelyn hadn't expected to see Ryan again. Their encounter in the spice aisle seemed like the kind of fleeting moment that life sprinkled in occasionally, brief, pleasant, and gone as quickly as it came. But a week later, there he was, leaning against the display of apples, holding up two different kinds and frowning in concentration. Evelyn hesitated, wondering if she should say hello or simply slip past unnoticed. Before she could decide, he looked up and caught her eye. "Evelyn," he said, his face lighting up. "You're just the person I needed." She raised an eyebrow, trying to hide the small jolt of warmth at being remembered. "Apple-related emergency." "Sort of," he admitted, holding up the fruits. "Do you go for tart or sweetened pies?" It turned into a 10-minute conversation, standing there by the apples, about recipes and baking mishaps. He told her about his latest culinary adventure, chicken paprika, which had turned out surprisingly edible, and she found herself laughing more than she had in weeks. From then on, their meetings at the grocery store became a regular occurrence. Sometimes they were accidental, running into each other in different aisles, and sometimes it felt as though Ryan timed his trips to coincide with hers. "What are the odds?" he'd joke, though the gleam in his eye suggested it wasn't entirely coincidence. Their conversations began to stretch beyond food. Evelyn learned that Ryan had moved to town recently, following a job opportunity in a nearby design firm. He talked about how the adjustment had been harder than expected, the loneliness of starting over in a new place. She shared stories of her own, a life spent in the same town, raising her kids and finding solace in her routines. What struck her most was how easy it was to talk to him. There was no pretense, no awkward silences. Ryan had a way of listening that made her feel like the most interesting person in the world, even when she was talking about something as mundane as the best way to keep basil fresh. One day, as they stood in the parking lot after running into each other yet again, Ryan asked, "Do you always shop on Thursdays?" "Pretty much," Evelyn said, a little puzzled. "Good to know." He grinned. "Maybe I'll see you next week." And with that he was gone, leaving her standing there with a cart full of groceries and a heart that felt strangely lighter. Over the following weeks, their casual encounters evolved into something more deliberate. Ryan began texting her, a simple, neat advice. Thyme or rosemary quickly turned into longer conversations that stretched into the evening. Evelyn found herself looking forward to their chats, to the way he made her laugh, to the way he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts. It wasn't just the attention that captivated her, though she couldn't deny how good it felt to be noticed. It was the way Ryan brought a sense of novelty into her life, a spark of energy she hadn't realized she was missing. For years, her world had been small and predictable, defined by the routines she'd built to protect herself from disappointment. But now, with every text, every shared laugh, every fleeting moment in the grocery store, Evelyn felt that world expanding. And though she didn't want to admit it, even to herself, she found herself looking forward to seeing him again, not just as a friend, but as someone who made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Evelyn didn't see it coming, the moment when her feelings shifted. It wasn't a grand revelation or a dramatic scene, but something subtle, a quiet realization that settled over her like the evening dusk. They were sitting on a bench outside the grocery store, sipping coffee from the shop nearby. Ryan had convinced her to join him after another one of their chance meetings. "Come on," he'd said, flashing that easy grin. "I owe you at least 1 cup of coffee for all the culinary wisdom you've shared." They talked about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing as naturally as the breeze around them. Ryan told her about his struggles to adjust to a smaller town and his dreams of designing sustainable homes. Evelyn found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected, sharing stories about her children, her late husband, and the life she had built and lost. "I've always admired that," Ryan said, his voice thoughtful. "What?" she asked, tilting her head. "The way you talk about your life. There's so much strength in it. You've been through so much, but you're still here, still finding joy in the little things." His words struck something deep within her. Evelyn felt her breath catch as she met his gaze, warm and steady. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, the sounds of passing cars and distant chatter fading into the background. It was in that moment she felt it, the spark that had been quietly growing into a flame. Her heart stirred in a way it hadn't in years, catching her completely off guard. When she returned home that evening, the feeling lingered, unsettling in its intensity. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of tea in front of her, replaying the scene in her mind. "He's just a friend," she told herself. "He's kind, he listens, but that's all this is." But the truth clung to her, undeniable and unshakable. The way he looked at her, the way he seemed to genuinely value her thoughts and stories. It wasn't just friendship. And it wasn't just him. It was her. The feelings she'd buried. The part of her that longed for connection and intimacy had begun to surface. Evelyn had spent so long convincing herself that part of her life was over, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone, to be wanted in return. But now, here she was, standing on the edge of something she couldn't name. The exhilaration was tempered by fear. He was younger, much younger. What would he think if he knew how she felt? What would the world think? Evelyn pressed her hands to her face, torn between the excitement of possibility and the terror of vulnerability. She felt like a teenager again, overwhelmed by emotions she hadn't experienced in decades. Yet, beneath the fear, there was something else. Hope. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder if love might still have a place in her life, even if it came in the most unexpected form. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Evelyn found herself caught between the thrill of her newfound feelings and the suffocating weight of doubt. When she thought of Ryan, his easy laughter, his thoughtful words, the way he seemed to genuinely see her, her heart swelled with a joy she hadn't felt in years. She replayed their moments together like a favorite song, each memory stirring something deep within her. But then came the doubts, creeping in like shadows. He was younger, decades younger. What would people say if they knew? Evelyn had spent her life avoiding judgment, keeping her head down, and doing what was expected of her. And yet, here she was on the brink of something that felt wildly out of bounds. She tried to rationalize it. He's just friendly. This is all in your head. Why would someone like him see you as anything more than a friend? And yet, there were moments she couldn't ignore. The way his gaze lingered a second longer than necessary, the warmth in his voice when he said her name, the text messages that seemed to arrive just when she needed them most. One evening, as she sat in her garden, Evelyn allowed herself to feel the full weight of it all. The cool breeze carried the scent of lavender, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink. It was the kind of peaceful evening she'd always loved, but tonight, it did little to calm her racing mind. Is it wrong to feel this way? She wondered, clutching her teacup tightly. She thought of her children, her friends. What would they say if they knew? The image of their disapproval stung, a harsh reminder of the world's expectations. But then she thought of Ryan. She thought of the way he listened, truly listened, as if her words carried a weight she hadn't felt in years. She thought of the way he made her laugh, how his presence seemed to brighten even the dullest moments. What if this is real? The thought was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Evelyn spent sleepless nights wrestling with her emotions. She read articles about intergenerational relationships, trying to make sense of her own heart. She scrolled through forums where people shared stories of love defying age gaps and societal norms. Some were hopeful, others cautionary. One post stood out to her. Love is never wrong when it's honest. The hardest part is giving yourself permission to feel it. Evelyn closed her laptop, the words lingering in her mind. She realized that her fear wasn't just about what others might think. It was about allowing herself to take a risk. She had built a life that was safe and predictable. But what if that safety was keeping her from something extraordinary? The thought stayed with her as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. For years, she had accepted that love was something she'd had and lost, a chapter of her life that was firmly closed. But now, with Ryan, she felt the stirrings of a new story, one she hadn't expected but couldn't ignore. As the night stretched on, Evelyn made a quiet promise to herself. She wouldn't make any decisions out of fear. Whatever this was, whatever it could be, she owed it to herself to at least explore it. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt ready to face it. It started as an innocent idea, or so Evelyn told herself. She had been potting new plants in her garden when her thoughts drifted, as they often did lately, to Ryan. Their conversations had grown deeper, more personal and more frequent. She found herself looking forward to their next encounter with an anticipation she hadn't felt in years. What if she invited him over? The thought startled her. She hadn't had anyone, let alone a man, in her home in years. Her house was her sanctuary, a space where she kept the world at arm's length. But the more she thought about it, the more the idea took root. Her reasoning was practical, or so she convinced herself. Ryan had mentioned his interest in learning more about gardening during one of their conversations. He joked about his inability to keep even a cactus alive, and Evelyn had teasingly offered to teach him a few tricks. It's just an invitation, she told herself, brushing dirt off her hands. Nothing more. Still, as she drafted the text, her hands trembled slightly. She stared at the screen, debating whether it was too forward, too presumptuous. Finally, she hit send. I remembered you mentioning your black thumb. If you're free this weekend, I could show you a few gardening tips. No pressure, of course. The response came quickly. That sounds great. I'd love to. Saturday work. Evelyn's heart raced as she typed out her reply, confirming the time. The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparation and nerves. She spent more time cleaning her house than she had in months, making sure everything was just right. Her garden, already immaculate, received extra attention. When Saturday arrived, Evelyn found herself pacing her living room, a bundle of nerves. She had laid out a tray with iced tea and cookies. Simple, friendly, nothing too suggestive. The sound of Ryan's knock sent her heart into overdrive. She opened the door to find him standing there, a small potted plant in his hands. For you, he said with a sheepish grin. Figured it's only fair to give you something to work with. She laughed, taking the plant, a half-wilted basil. You weren't kidding about your black thumb. Consider it a challenge, he said, stepping inside. The afternoon unfolded with surprising ease. They moved between the garden and the kitchen, her teaching him how to repot plants and him asking endless questions that made her laugh. At one point, as they were kneeling side by side in the dirt, Ryan paused, looking at her with a thoughtful expression. "You're really good at this," he said. "At what?" "Making people feel at home." The words caught her off guard, and for a moment she couldn't speak. The sincerity in his voice, the warmth in his eyes, it was disarming. "Thank you," she said softly, looking away to hide the flush she felt creeping up her cheeks. As the afternoon turned into evening, Evelyn realized how natural it felt to have him there. For the first time in years, her house felt alive, filled with the sound of laughter and conversation. When Ryan finally left, promising to keep his new basil alive, Evelyn stood in the doorway, watching him walk down the path. Her heart was full, yet there was a quiet ache too, a longing she couldn't ignore. The step she had taken felt small, yet monumental. She had opened her world to him, and in doing so, had taken one step closer to confronting her feelings. Whether this was the beginning of something more, she didn't know. But for the first time in years, Evelyn felt the walls she'd built around herself start to crumble, and it terrified and thrilled her all at once. The evening was unexpectedly perfect. After weeks of casual encounters, lingering texts, and stolen moments, Evelyn found herself standing at the kitchen counter, preparing dinner for two. She hadn't cooked for anyone in a long time, and the simple act of chopping vegetables felt strangely intimate. Ryan was on his way over. She had invited him once again, this time for something a little more personal, a home-cooked meal. There was something about the idea of sharing a meal with him that felt like the natural next step, something beyond the friendly exchanges they had shared before. When he arrived, he greeted her with that familiar warmth, his smile genuine as always. "Smells amazing in here," he said, peeking into the oven. Evelyn smiled, a bit nervous. "I hope it lives up to the hype." They fell into a rhythm that felt comfortable, but not ordinary. They set the table together, and their conversation flowed as easily as it had in the past, though tonight, something in the air felt different, charged, perhaps, with the anticipation of what was to come. After dinner, they sat in the living room, sipping wine, the conversation drifting between topics. But tonight, there was a deeper undercurrent to everything they said. Evelyn could feel it in the way Ryan's gaze lingered on her a little longer than usual, in the quiet moments where neither of them spoke, and the silence seemed to hum with unspoken words. At one point, as they sat close, laughing over something trivial, Ryan reached out and brushed a strand of hair away from her face. The gesture was small, but it sent a jolt through her. Her heart raced as he leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. For a second, she thought he might kiss her. She closed her eyes, anticipating it, but the kiss never came. Instead, he pulled back, looking at her with a tenderness that was almost too much to bear. I've really enjoyed getting to know you," he said, his voice low, sincere. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. "What is this?" she thought. "What are we doing?" Her thoughts were a whirl of conflicting emotions, but as she looked into Ryan's eyes, the truth was undeniable. She cared for him, more than she had allowed herself to admit. More than she had thought was possible. "You make everything feel different," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan's smile softened, and he reached for her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "I feel the same way." The air between them was thick with unspoken words. And then, without another thought, Evelyn closed the distance between them. Her lips brushed his, tentative at first, unsure. But Ryan responded with a softness that melted her hesitation. The kiss deepened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn let go of all her fears and doubts. She let herself feel the warmth of Ryan's hand on her skin, the fluttering in her chest, the connection that had slowly grown between them. It was more than a kiss. It was a confirmation of everything they had been tiptoeing around. It was a promise that whatever this was, it was real. When they finally pulled apart, neither of them spoke immediately. They simply sat there, side by side, their fingers intertwined, the weight of the moment settling around them. Evelyn's heart was still racing, but there was a calm that followed, a certainty that hadn't been there before. She realized, with a quiet kind of relief, that she wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever this was, whatever it would become, she wasn't alone in it. And that, more than anything, was enough. The days following that night were a blur of emotion. Evelyn found herself in a kind of suspended reality, caught between the thrill of what had happened and the uncertainty of what might come next. She spent hours reflecting on the kiss, on the way Ryan's touch had felt, the way his warmth had seemed to fill all the empty spaces in her life. It was a feeling she had forgotten, intense, consuming, and yet so utterly unfamiliar. She had told herself for years that those feelings were behind her, that the love she had known in her youth and her marriage was all that was left for her. But Ryan had changed that. His presence, his kindness, his patience. He had awakened something deep inside her, something she hadn't realized was still there, quietly waiting. Evelyn knew she couldn't ignore the reality of their age difference forever. She had lived through enough to know that love didn't always follow the script society wrote for it. She had seen judgment in the eyes of others when she'd been out with friends, heard whispers behind her back about the way she looked or the way she carried herself. The world wasn't kind to women who dared to seek love beyond their prescribed years. The unspoken rules were clear: love, passion, desire. Those were for the young. Not for women like her. But as she lay in bed one evening, staring out the window at the stars, she realized something she hadn't before. Love didn't care about age, or what society said. Love simply was. Her heart ached with a bittersweet clarity. Yes, there was fear. Yes, there was the weight of judgment that hovered around her. But none of that had the power to stop her from feeling what she felt for Ryan. And it wasn't just about the chemistry, the physical attraction, though that too was undeniable. It was about how he made her feel, how he saw her. Ryan didn't see the wrinkles around her eyes or the gray in her hair. He saw her, Evelyn, the woman who had lived a full life, the woman who had wisdom, stories, and laughter to share. The more she reflected, the more she understood that it wasn't love's age that mattered. It was the depth of the connection, the sincerity of the emotions that bound them. And what they shared was real, regardless of what others might think. Evelyn knew, now more than ever, that love was not a limited resource, nor a stage of life that had an expiration date. It was a force that could arise at any moment in any form. It didn't care about the calendar or the lines on her face. It only cared about the hearts that were brave enough to feel it. She thought of her children, of how they might react, of how the world might react. But she realized, with surprising clarity, that it no longer mattered. She had spent her whole life worrying about the judgments of others. This time, she was going to live for herself. The love she had found with Ryan wasn't a phase or a fleeting moment, it was a gift. A gift that defied expectations, that stretched beyond the limits of age, that reminded her that life wasn't finished at 50, that new beginnings could emerge at any time. Her heart no longer belonged to the fear of judgment. It belonged to the man who had brought a spark into her life when she thought it had long since died out. And as she let that realization sink in, Evelyn smiled, a quiet acceptance blooming in her chest. Love, she understood now, was not a question of age. It was a matter of timing, and the courage to embrace it. Evelyn stood at her garden gate one afternoon, the sun casting a soft golden glow over the flowers she had nurtured so carefully. It had been months since that first hesitant invitation, since that simple gesture had turned her world upside down. Looking back, she realized how much had changed, not just in her relationship with Ryan, but within herself. The woman who had once lived cautiously, who had built walls around her heart to protect it from the disappointments of the past, was no longer the same person. Her love for Ryan had shown her that she could still feel, still desire, still give herself to someone fully and without hesitation. She had learned that love wasn't something confined to a particular chapter of life. It was a constant, ever-evolving force. It didn't bow to the rules that society set out, nor to the expectations that others tried to impose on her. It simply existed. They had grown together, their connection becoming something deeper than either of them had anticipated. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments where Evelyn questioned whether she was doing the right thing, whether the world would judge them. But with Ryan, she had found not only love, but a deep sense of companionship, of understanding that transcended age, experience, and all the things that were meant to divide them. Ryan had shown her what it meant to love fearlessly, to give herself permission to experience joy and intimacy once more. She had learned from him the power of vulnerability, of being willing to risk everything for something real. And in turn, she had shown him the beauty of patience, of finding connection in the quiet, ordinary moments. As she looked over her garden, her heart full, Evelyn thought of all the women and men who felt as though their time for love had passed. She thought of the societal pressures, the quiet whispers of "it's too late, you're too old," and how they tried to suppress the natural desires that arose. Evelyn wanted to shout to the world, to anyone who would listen, love doesn't end at a certain age. It doesn't have an expiration date. It can happen at any time, at any age, and it can be just as wild and just as beautiful as it ever was. She turned back toward the house, feeling the weight of this truth settle within her like a quiet revelation. Love had never been something to fear. It was a gift, and it was hers to embrace fully. No longer would she hold back, no longer would she allow the world's opinions to dictate what she could or couldn't experience. As Ryan came up the walk, his smile bright and easy, Evelyn felt a quiet joy bloom in her chest. They had made it through the doubts, the fears, and the uncertainties. And now, they were walking forward together, hand in hand, into whatever the future might hold. She smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. Love had no boundaries, no restrictions. And in this moment, with Ryan by her side, Evelyn knew that the best part of her life was still unfolding, one beautiful moment at a time. And for the first time in years, she was ready to embrace it all.